Today I would like to show you how to transform a glossy finish into this satin finish. Most guitars come with a thick layer of polyurethane clear coat that will make your instrument look like candy. Compared to a nitro finish or a satin finish, this not only looks less appealing but also feels sticky, especially on the backside of the neck. In this video, I would like to give you a rundown of how I dull the finish into the satin look. I've already done this mod 2 times on 2 other Epiphones and both turned out really great, but it works best on translucent finishes. So when I recently got this Korean-made 95 Les Paul Standard, I really wanted to repeat the process and document it. You don't need any special tools for this, but I find that using a palm sander is giving me the most uniform result and also is much quicker than doing the whole guitar by hand. All you need is a Scotch-Brite cleaning pad and basic tools for the teardown. There's no need to unsolder any electronics or pickups, so it's just a matter of taking your time and being able to put the guitar back together afterwards. Step 1. Stripping the guitar of the hardware, removing strings, bridge and tailpiece. You can see me using string winders for faster loosening. I usually like to keep the original strings, but of course you can install a fresh set if your strings are dead. I also noted down the string height on the high E and low E string on the 12th fret before the teardown. This is optional, but since we're removing the bridge posts, we'll have to do a basic setup after the reassembly, so these numbers will be a good guide afterwards. The tailpiece posts on my model were screwed down, so I'm using this screwdriver to get them out. It doesn't make sense for me to remove the bushings, and since they started corroding anyways, I'm actually fine with them being exposed to the Scotch-Brite cleaning pads. Removing knobs and toggle poker chip. I've had a bunch of guitars where the knobs are really hard to remove, and over the years I've tried a few methods, but for me the safest way to remove them is to use a cloth, guiding it underneath the knob and pulling upwards. That gives you a nice leverage without scratching the finish like with a screwdriver. It also distributes the force evenly, so you don't risk breaking the plastic knobs at some point. When it comes to removing the famous poker chips on Les Pauls, be aware that some of the Asian-made guitars are using adhesives, and they are prone to break if you're using too much force. You can try to use some heat and pry it using a thin pick. I've already replaced mine, so it's easy to remove. Removing tuners, bushings and the truss rod cover. Uninstalling your tuners is a straightforward task. These vintage tulip style tuners are usually secured with 2 screws on the back. Use a good Phillips screwdriver and remove the screws. What I usually like to do is mark my tuners so I can reinstall the correct ones later on. So I'll just note down the string names on a piece of tape and put them on the backside of the tuner. Notice how even after all these years it's hard for me to get this right on a reversed layout. I have to check the headstock from the front to get an idea which tuner is what string. Now that the screws are removed, the tuners are not held in place, and of course I drop 5 of them as soon as I turn the guitar around. Maybe be more careful than me and just take them out while the guitar is flipped around. Some of the bushings are easy to remove, but I've had some stubborn ones that needed a gentle tap. Never try to pry these from the front. I usually get a flathead screwdriver that fits in the hole and I just give it a slight tap from the backside. That usually does the trick. The truss rod cover is held in place by 3 screws on most of these Asian Les Paul guitars. This is an older style Epiphone truss rod cover that is usually a dead giveaway for 90s or early 2000 models. I'll definitely want to keep it on later. Removing the pickup rings. This usually is just 4 screws on each pickup ring, securing them to the body, and 2 screws on each side that allow you to set the pickup height. On this older guitar, corrosion has rusted away most of the screw heads, so in such cases I usually use a small flathead screwdriver and try to find a grip somewhere in there. It's a good idea to replace them once you have these sorts of problems. You can find such screws in hardware stores around you, and there's nothing worse than a stripped screw. I also take note of the pickup ring orientation. It should follow the top carve of your guitar. Now onto the removal of the last 2 spring-loaded screws per pickup. These are easy to lose, so be extra careful with them. Now that they aren't held in place, I just use some tape to secure the pickups into their cavities. Securing toggle and pots. Since I'm going to sand the top and back of this guitar, I opted for the easiest way to get the toggle switch and the volume and tone pots out of the way. I will use some tape to cover up the cavities, and there's enough room for the components to stay in place. No need to unsolder anything, I'll just keep them in there. What's interesting about this control plate is how it's grounded to one pot. There's a small strip of conductive tape that goes from the side of the cavity and is making contact with the shielding on the back side of the plate once it's screwed down. That's a good way of quieting down noisy electronics. The pots are held in place with a nut. The best way to remove them is to hold them from the back and use a deep socket hex driver from the front to unscrew the nut. Since I don't want to lose the washer and nut, I just put it on the pot again and tape the back of the control cavity. Removing the input jack plate and securing the input jack. Next I'm going to remove the input jack plate, which is screwed into the body with 4 screws. Always remove the plate first and then use a wrench while holding the jack in place. I also put the washer and nut back onto the input jack so I don't lose them. It looks like on this model, the hole for the input jack went through a repair. There's epoxy on the sides, but it looks very well done and flush with the body, so no worries. Removing strap pins. The strap pins usually are easy to remove with just a Phillips screwdriver, but in my case the rear one is stripped and I broke one of my flathead screwdrivers trying to loosen it. I've seen people trying to glue the screws into the body, and they can be quite hard to remove sometimes. My advice for stripped out screw holes is just to use a toothpick and some glue, which will secure the screw but also is much easier to work with afterwards. Step 2. Cleaning. Now that the guitar has been fully stripped, it's time to clean this guitar thoroughly. I've noticed that the guitar has some scratches in the clear coat, especially on the backside. This will look slightly better after the sanding process, but you will still be able to see these imperfections afterwards. If this is bothering you, you can try to polish them out before the actual dulling process, but I don't mind a few wear marks here and there. Step 3. First round of dulling with heavier grit Scotch-Brite cleaning pad. So now that the guitar has been cleaned, I took this outside and have all my tools ready. The pads are sticky and should cover the entire surface of your sander. This is important so that you don't ding up your finish. There are different grids of this cleaning pad. I usually go with the heavier grit first. Please make sure to wear a face mask for safety reasons. The dust coming off this guitar should not be getting in your airways. I usually start with the backside to see how thick the finish is. Theoretically, you can always polish the finish back to high gloss, so that's always reassuring to know. I'm not using a lot of force on a sander. I would rather let the sander do its job and use circular motion. Since there's an area on the backside that had some scratches in the clear coat, I'm using a bit more force here. Don't worry about the looks as of now. The dust will come off later on and it's definitely not as bad as you might be thinking. Make sure to go light on the edges of the guitar. Those areas usually have less clear coat, and although it's hard to burn through all these layers, you don't want that to happen. After the first pass, I just like to wipe it down with a microfiber cloth and check the result. You can already tell it's going to be satin. Depending on how the finish feels, I decide to go for another pass. It feels so much smoother and the shine is nearly completely gone. Sanding the neck is a little bit more complicated. Don't worry about changing the neck profile, as the sander will only take off a little of the clear coat. The back of the headstock is flat, so it's easy to just sand over it. The serial number and Made in Korea sticker are underneath the clear coat, so they're not going to be affected at all. The hardest parts to dull are the sides and the heel. I'll have to manually do those afterwards. You can definitely see the difference on the heel, it's still very shiny. The same process is now repeated on the front of the guitar. The logo and script are also under a thick layer of clear coat, so I'll just sand over it. Since the headstock is gloss black, I'll just lightly go over it because this is the area that will show most of the swirls or scratches later on. Since this guitar has a curved top, you will have to angle the sander, but don't worry about going over the same spot more than others. You just want the whole top to be done, since any unfinished spots will be visible. The hardest part to do is the area where the fretboard meets the body, but it's also just a very small detail that won't stand out. After wiping it with a microfiber cloth, the top already pops like a Gibson, even though it's only a veneer, not actual thick flamed maple. I decided to go for another pass on the top to make sure I didn't miss a spot. The sides on the guitar are also still glossy, so I'll do my best to get most areas done with the sander. There are going to be a lot of arches and the sander won't be able to reach them, especially in the cutaway area. By this time I already noticed how the pad was clogged and no longer was cutting as much of the clear coat as before, so it might be a good idea to clean it. Now I'll have to start manually sanding the harder to reach areas. The cutaway is a little tricky here. Don't use too much pressure or else you will see swirl marks and scratches. I also did the sides on the headstock and the corners. Sometimes it helps to roll the pad into a different shape so you can reach these areas, especially near the logo. The last part I'll do is the heel and neck join, and I'm also lightly going over the sides again. Step 4. Dulling with a lighter grit pad. After a wipe down, I was happy with the level of satin, but there were some swirl marks, so now it was time to use the lighter grit pad. So now we're on to the second round of dulling with a lighter grit cleaning pad. So this is basically the same steps as before, just with a lighter grit. This is done to make sure you get a clean and uniform surface. After multiple passes with both grids, I'm happy with the outcome and we're ready to move on to the next step. Step 5. Wipe down with Carnauba wax. Now that the guitar is all sanded, it's time to give it a nice rub down with Carnauba wax. This will make the colors pop and at the same time protect the finish. I noticed that the scratches on the back were now somewhat more pronounced, and that's because the dust from the clear coat is still in all these spots. After using the Carnauba wax, all of these were gone and the surface looks brighter yet still feels smooth to the touch. As you might be able to tell, I jumped a few steps here and already reassembled the guitar. I tried to reshoot the whole process of using Carnauba wax to wipe it down, but there's a good laugh in there for you because the bottle was clogged and I should have spent more time trying to unclog it. Instead, what happened is that I completely sprayed everything that was in there on the guitar. It took a few minutes and a few towels to get this cleaned, but after a nice rub down, this thing is now protected for the next coming years. And yes, I do realize that this has some potential for a naughty joke, but I don't think it would be appropriate for this kind of content. Step 6. Reassembly. This is basically step 1 in reverse order. The hardest part for me always is the pickup height screws, because they're spring-loaded and they need to be pressed down while screwing them in. After the reassembly, I did a basic setup and ended up with a lower string height, but that's due to personal preference, I just like them really low. Final conclusion. This is an easy mod everyone can do, and it gets you a much nicer look and feel in the matter of 2 hours. So why not go for it? Let me know if you already tried this kind of mod, or if you're going to give this a shot after seeing this video. Also, if you have any kind of questions, just write them in the comments below and I'll try to answer as soon as possible. Just a quick disclaimer, I'm not a real luthier, I'm doing this based on my knowledge and I'm not responsible if you hurt your guitar in any way. But anyways, thanks for watching and goodbye.